just like to introduce Robin Tait. She runs Tait Bindery. She's an extraordinary paper conservator and a very extraordinary book conservator. So she's talking about her experience as a bookbinder.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Danny, for that very informative and thought-provoking talk, which I hope mine will be up to scratch for. So tonight I wanted to talk about my journey to become a book conservator, and as you can see from the slide, it's been quite a varied journey, and my one comment is that this journey has been one of, shall we say, a lifelong vocation to become trained as a book conservator. I started at the University of Canberra when it was actually called CCAE, or Canberra College of Advanced Education, and eventually did my degree in paper conservation. I then went on to the Camberwell School of Art and Craft in London and did hand bookbinding and book restoration, as it was called then. It was a one-year course, and during that time we did hand training in the English tradition of bookbinding. And it started with very simple things like pamphlet bindings, and we moved right through in the one-year course at a fairly brisk pace, I may add, to doing fine hand binding. So it was a bit of sort of like, get your work done now and hurry up because we've actually got to move on to something else. I then, when I came back to Australia, I was employed at the War Memorial, and at the same time I set up the Tait Bindery. And from that time on, I have been working and training and learning all about the different book structures and book conservation problems that actually are presented to practitioners in my area on a regular basis. I also was very fortunate in 1984 to gain a Rotary Foundation scholarship, and I was able to train with James Brockman in Oxford. James is a master bookbinder who was trained in the Cockerell tradition, and for those of you who know, that will mean that he has trained in the school of T.J. Cobden Sanderson, who was the bookbinder for the Kelmscott Press, which was William Morris's press in the 19th century. I also have done a certificate at the University of Melbourne in art authentication, and that has actually been quite useful in my paper conservation, looking at authenticating artworks and even just deciding whether or not something is actually what it's purported to be. So, what do you need for hand bookbinding besides the traditional skills? This is an example of the sort of things that you need to be able to understand. The technique that this has been bound with is it's sewn on tapes. Sorry, I beg your pardon, and it's a quarter leather binding. It has marbled paper sides, and the lacing through the top is actually a vellum strip, which has then been inserted through the spine and either side of the actual spine. To arrive at that, you actually need to be able to know how to put together the leaves or the pages of the actual book that you have. You have to be able to know how the structure is going to work with the paper you've chosen for it, and if you're then going to put on decorative elements of that, you need to know that you're looking at doing a headband of some description, foredge treatments, for example, or edge gildings, things like that, and then finally your gold tooling, which all forms part of a handbook binding tradition. It also means that when you're looking at the books that you have clients bring to you for repair, it means that you can identify whether or not it's a case binding or a laced on boards binding such as this one, or you're looking at some other traditional structure made possibly before these particular bindings came about, such as the early Coptic manuscript techniques or the German long-stitch non-adhesive techniques. So it's not just learning how to do binding in one particular tradition, it's also looking at the traditions of other cultures as well. And paper conservation, it's an area where you need to be actually able to look at the entire object, know how it's been created before you even start tackling the problems that are presented here. And before you all sort of gasp, this actually spent its time in a shed with the rats. So you can understand, we have some quite interesting things come past our eyes in private conservation practice. At first glance, this is a painted portrait, and you'd be well and truly forgiven for thinking it's just simply that. However, this is actually a salted paper print, which is a very early form of photography. And over that, the artist has actually done the drawing and painting of the sitter and basically fleshed in the portrait. This was taken from a smaller portrait. It was probably an ambrotype that existed in the parish, and the sitter is actually the Reverend Brown, who was the Archdeacon at the Launceston Church. He was the very first one who was appointed. The portrait was done around about 1860, and that by its very date gives us quite a good idea of when what techniques were available at that time, and therefore it also gives you the clues as to what you're looking at with the actual structure and manufacture of the artefact. This artefact was also, it's on a paper support, as you can see around the frontal lobotomy, and it's also lined onto a cotton cloth, which was then put onto a strainer and framed up. So it was quite a complex object in itself. As you can see, the after photos show that it was quite a successful treatment, and to the point where we ended up, this was completely taken off the original stretcher, washed, lined, and the repair was a complete new piece of paper actually put onto the new strainer cloth, and then it was in-painted to match it. This is a Bible which was split in half, and fortunately I was able to identify that it had been sewn on tapes, and therefore I was able to insert new tapes underneath the original tapes, therefore not disrupting the original sewing. Here you can see the end of the spine, and you can see the slightly, shall we say, reverse engineering techniques that I use for putting back the tail of the headband and the head cap of this particular book. It was very satisfying working on this particular thing, but you can also see that it had its hairy moments as well, particularly trying to maintain the gold tooling across on the title. So if you want to become a book conservator, as you can see, there's a large number of avenues that you actually have to pursue to do that. It means that you need the traditional hand skills of a bookbinder to be able to understand what you're looking at. You need the paper conservation skills to be able to repair the texts, and mostly for my work, particularly when I'm dealing with Holy Bibles and family documents, the paper conservation skills that are required for that are actually highly important. Family documents and the family registers in Bibles seem to be afflicted with insects, sticky tape, masking tape, and all sorts of interesting adhesives to hold them together. And my skills as a paper conservator come to the fore when trying to preserve that particular aspect of the family history. The other thing that you will need if you're going to become a book conservator is financial support. I have to say that other than my training in Australia, which was very fortunately at Australian University when we had our fees paid for, which was just wonderful. The training I've done overseas has all been either self-funded or as a result of a scholarship or a fellowship. And finally, we need the qualified and professional teachers, and also the courses offered in a science base rather than an arts base for conservation. Conservation isn't about putting together or painting pretty pictures onto restoring artworks and things like that. It's about actually understanding the materials that you're dealing with and putting a treatment in place that will not further deteriorate the actual item that you're dealing with, so that people are able to enjoy it for years to come. And finally, we need the recognition of and the support of the professional bodies, particularly ours in particular, which is the Australian Institute of Conservation of Cultural Material. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much.